back a bit, and right to the opening in 1906 of the Manhattan Opera House, filled with the Manhattan Opera Company. Oscar had decided he was going to have the best of everything. So he hired this man right here, Cleofante Campanini, who was the head, one of the major music directors at La Scala. And there was another guy there by the name of Toscanini, but he was just a young kid, and he just started, and he didn't want to jump off the cliff, so to speak, and come across the sea and start a startup opera company. This is a startup opera company we're talking about. But Campanini was ready to go. So Campanini came, and particularly because every single production that Oscar Hammerstein did the first season, and he did basically your Italian, German repertoire, but it all had to be done from scratch. He didn't have any. He didn't have sets. He didn't have costumes. Everything had to. He did have an opera house, so everything had to be designed from scratch. So everything was brand new, and the audiences in New York were very ready for brand new. Oscar then went out and hired. Are you ready? Nellie Melba. Of Peach Melba, of Melba Toast. Nellie Melba was the biggest opera star in the entire world in 1906. And Oscar Hammerstein got her to come. She had worked at the Met 2 years before and gotten sick and after the first performance, and gotten so sick that she had to go home. And she really didn't want to come back to America, so Oscar had to woo her. And she kept saying, no, 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 no. And the very last time he saw her, he took $1,100 bills. And as he walked out of the room, he said, well, if you don't want to come here, and he threw them up in the air. And he walked out and down the hall, and she laughed like crazy, and she signed her contract the next day. So, he hired Nellie Melba. But guess who else he hired? Elma Calvé. Is that pronounced? Calvé? Calvé. Emma Calvé. Emma Calvé was almost as big as Nellie Melba. And guess what? They didn't like each other. They wouldn't even sit in the same dinner table with each other. So, needless to say, they did not sing in the Manhattan Opera House at the same time in season 1. Melba came, sang for a while, and then she went home to England and Covent Garden, and Emma came. So he had both of them. Then he pulled another coup. He got, does anyone know who this is? Alessandro Banci. Banci was the tenor in the world. Now, of course, the Met had just hired Enrico Caruso, but Enrico Caruso was not Banci. Okay, and those people who, if you look back over long interviews and everything, there were those people who said Caruso never got to be Banci. It was just a really major coup. And so New York was suddenly treated to 2 opera houses that they could go to, and they went in huge numbers. And good old Oscar made money hand over fist. He made so much money that in the spring of 1907, which would have been just after the end of his first season, he sat down with one Victor Herbert and said, "It is time, Vic, for American opera. You are to write it." At this time, Herbert was a household name. He had written 25 at least operettas. He was a big thing. There wasn't anybody in America who did not know who Victor Herbert was. And Victor Herbert said, "You know, you're right, I want to." And so he signed the contract. As soon as he signed the contract, it was, Oscar made sure it was all over the papers, and all over the, oh, yada, da, 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 look who I got, Mr. Metropolitan Opera Company. And that's, to a certain extent, what prompted the one-act contest that was launched in the next 6-7 months to find an American opera. Let's see. Now, for this second as we go into the second season, Oscar made another hiring. He hired Mary Garden. Mary Garden was born in Scotland and raised in Chicago, so she was almost an American. Well, she was as much American as anybody else, and probably as those of us in the room. We're all from immigrants, right? Mary Garden was the toast of Friends, and every single major French composer of opera at the end of the turn of the century and into the early 20th century wrote for Mary Garden. It's not like she was doing, tried and true old stuff. Debussy wrote for her. She debuted almost every one of Debussy's operas. She was super duper. And if you're going to bring somebody who knows the French repertoire, then why don't you bring the rest of the company from Paris? And that's what Oscar did. Brought the rest of the company. So that, let's see who was there. Make sure that I get the right thing here. Going from, my page is out of order. Oh no, Mr. Bill. Time out while Alice gets on the right page. That's what happens when you have pages fall off your podium. Mary Garden was the Laurence Olivier and Sarah Bernhardt of acting in the opera world. She never looked the same way twice. You've seen a picture of her. This is the way she looked. You saw her as Natoma. You can't get terribly much more homely than her Natoma. She wore wigs, and until she found the right wig, she couldn't find the character. So she would refuse to wear wigs if they didn't really fit the character. Vocally, she produced a sound that met the character. So there were critics who said Mary Garden can't sing. She could sing very, very well, as you just heard in the range in her opening, one of her opening arias. Huge range. So she could sing. Some of the people who came with her are Del Morris, Bassi, Renaud, and Mario San Marco was with the company all 4 years. And of course, we still had Melba and Calvin running around. So the program, the company was getting bigger and bigger. He also, at this time, the Met was going down to Philly every week. Okay? So they do something up here in New York, and then they take the company down to Philly. They were in the Academy of Music. Well, they had booked the Academy of Music. What was Oscar to do? What Oscar always does. He built an opera house, an acoustically perfect opera house. He announced it in March of 1908. He opened it November of 1908. That building was built between March and November. By who? Poor Arthur. In fact, Arthur was standing in the Manhattan Opera House at the back when he heard his dad say, "Oh, by the way, come to the third season. We're going to be in Philly next year at our own largest opera house in the world. It seated 4,000 people."
Oh my God.
And before Arthur could start building it, he had to tear down a mansion. Okay. There was another little thing. We talked about Victor Herbert saying, "Yes, I'll write the American opera," right? Have we said anything about a libretto? No. Were we talking about 1908? Yes. It would take Herbert until 1909, October of 1909, when this man actually found him. Joseph D. Redding was a Californian, and he was a bohemian out in California, so he looked up Herbert at the Lambs Club, and he gave him a treatment for an old California story that centered around an Indian, and they were off to the races. October 1909, Not a note had been written. It was finished in December of 1909. Okay? Oh, wait a minute. No, 1908 must be. Yes, 1908. October 1908. I'm sorry. It did take me more than a year to write it. Okay. Now, let's take you to the end of Act 1. You heard me talk about Lieutenant Paul walking around with Natoma and having found a nice exotic Indian to add to his quarries. As they walk around, they come upon this hacienda, and he says, "Who lives over there?" And Natoma says, "My really good friend Barbara, who's coming back from the convent today." And immediately, Lieutenant Paul's radar goes, "Oh," and he says, "Tell me." It's a moment when you want to kick him. He says, "Tell me about Barbara." Well, Natoma does very beautifully in another aria that we're not going to hear. But at the end of Act 1, Barbara and Lieutenant Paul have seen each other. Come on up, folks. And it truly was love at first sight. So picture yourself in California on the island of Santa Cruz in a nice soft spring night and the moon shining down. Barbara is musing about what she's just seen, and out of the shadows comes Lieutenant Paul.